Hello, everyone. My name is Esther Lee, the president of Chinese American Heritage Foundation. The foundation's CAHF is dedicated to celebrating the rich history of Chinese American contribution to the American spirit. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Today marked the 80th anniversary of Doolittle Raid. The raid was planned by, led by, and named after Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, and came to be known as the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders. They made the first strike against Japan on April 18, 1942, serving as retaliation for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and demonstrating that Japan was vulnerable to American air attack. In 2015, the Congressional Gold Medal was awarded to the members of the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders in recognition of their military service during World War II. Yet, a crucial story was mentioned very lightly in this history. Some heroic Chinese civilians saving the Doolittle Raiders, yet leading to 320,000 lives were sacrificed. Our book talk today is Last Mission to Tokyo by Michel Paradis. And panel discussion with Major General William Chen and Major General Darryll Wong will follow. Our author, Michel Paradis, is a leading scholar and lawyer of international law and human rights. He has won high-profile cases in courts around the globe and worked for over a decade with the U.S. Department of Defense, military commissions, defense of organization, where he led many of the landmark court cases to arise out of Guantanamo Bay. He also holds the position of lecturer at Columbia Law School, where he teaches on the military, the Constitution, and the law of war. Without further ado, let me have Michel Paradis.
Thank you so much for having me, especially on this 80th anniversary of the Doolittle Raid. I'm going to try and do a PowerPoint. I can't promise that I'm going to be technically proficient. That's why I went to law school as opposed to any other school, is because being technically proficient is something lawyers are notoriously bad at, as well as math. But I'm here to talk again about the Doolittle Raid, which was 80 years ago today, April 18th, 1942. If you give me 1 second, I promise I will try and make this PowerPoint work. Can folks see the PowerPoint presentation? Yes. Okay, good.
Yes.
I'm going to just say all. Okay. Okay. Sorry. I apologize. I'm about as technically proficient as I look.
That's okay. Take your time.
There we go. So yes. So I just wanted to start. So I wrote this book, Last Mission to Tokyo, which is in some ways a retelling of a familiar story for most Americans, which is the story of the Doolittle Raid from April 18th, 1942. In researching this book, when I first started, I went to Texas to visit with Jimmy Doolittle's co-pilot. This was the first plane off the deck of an aircraft carrier in what was, unquestionably a miraculous and probably the most celebrated military operation of the Second World War. And when I went to visit him at his home in Texas, he was, probably one of the finest gentlemen I've ever met. Certainly much sharper than me, even though he was 99 years old at the time. And he asked me, and he looked at me, and he was like, "I just don't understand why anyone would want to write another book about the Doolittle Raid." Because it's been depicted in many books, many movies, documentaries. You can't turn on the History Channel probably without seeing a story of the Doolittle Raid. And that question has stayed with me. It stayed with me as I wrote the book, as I've talked about the book subsequently. And I think one of the answers I have is that, we as a species, as human beings, are a storytelling species. And certain stories need to be told because, frankly, most people don't know them, certainly young people. And it's through stories that we learn and understand who we are, what we're capable of, what mistakes we can make, and how we can learn going forward. So I'll start with just a short telling of the the Doolittle Raid. As Esther mentioned, in 1942, not only had the United States been surprised by the attack on Pearl Harbor, but World War II did not look like it could be won. Germany had been on the advance, had invaded Russia. The United States and England were at best on the defensive. In Europe, had the North Africa campaign would not start until November of 1942. In Asia, not only had Japan done a stunning attack against the United States air base at what at the time was just the colony of Hawaii, but Japanese forces had proceeded all the way down the Malaya Peninsula, capturing Singapore, which was the crown jewel of the British Empire. The port city of Shanghai had been completely taken over by the Japanese in a single night. The Japanese were even bombing Australia, not to mention taking over the Philippines, which at the time had been the United States' largest colony in Asia. And so in April of 1942, we were in a world where it was not just important to say that America was in this war, that it was a war worth fighting for the sake of democracy and human rights and a better world free from imperial domination, whether it was Japanese or German, but that the United States could win this war. It was by no means obvious. And there was a need to strike back, to show that Pearl Harbor would not be left unanswered. And the question was raised, could the United States attack Japan? And the honest answer, the answer that math, something, again, lawyers are not particularly good at, the honest answer was no, it could not be. Japan was thousands of miles away from the nearest airfields. There had been a flight from the United States to Japan in the early 1930s. And in order to succeed, in order to get over the vast Pacific Ocean, they had to fly from the closest point inside the United States. They had to drop the wheels off the aircraft in order to essentially glide the last bit of way in, and the plane crashed into Japan. So if not sort of the Japanese sort of imperial success, just physics, Japan demanded and said that Japan was invulnerable from attack. And so the idea floated up, well, what if we took some serious bombers, some long-range American Army bombers off of an aircraft carrier and got them as close as possible to Japan? And this question was posed to the finest minds in the military bureaucracy of 1942, and the answer came back again, no, you can't do that. There are a lot of, again, just brute physics. But the question was ultimately given to a guy named Lieutenant Colonel, an 05, fairly mid-level military officer. Could this be done? And it was a man by the name of Jimmy Doolittle, who had spent much of the previous 2 decades becoming one of the premier celebrities, really, of aviation in the United States. Not only did he have the sort of daring do to be fined for unlawful acrobatics over airports, he had a doctorate from MIT, and he had become, through reputation, through practice, through experience, the preeminent aviator of his time and the man who could do the impossible. And so when he was presented with this problem, the obvious answer was no, but he figured it out. He did the math. And he realized that if you essentially stripped everything out of a B-25 mid-range US Army bomber, you could fill the rest of it with gas tanks, basically turn it into a flying gas can, put enough bombs inside of it to take off of an aircraft carrier and on a one-way mission over Japan and into China. And on April 18th, 1942, he and 80 other men, or 79 other men, the men who would go down in history as the Doodle Raiders, did a seemingly impossible feat in taking off these big, fat, blunt, glass-nosed U.S. Army bombers. If you look at the screen behind me, you can see one trying to take off and almost dipping down into the Pacific Ocean. But nevertheless, all 16 planes got off. All 16 planes made their way over Japan, struck back on targets in Tokyo, in Kobe, in Yokohama, and Nagoya, and showed that the United States was not only in this war, that it was in it to win it. And that Japan, despite its histories, literally thousands of years, in all of recorded history, Japan had never been attacked from abroad. In fact, the only time in recorded Japanese history that Japan had even that anyone had gotten close was in the 13th century, when Genghis Khan mounted a massive flotilla targeted across the Sea of Japan. Its size would not be rivaled until the D-Day invasions of 1944. And as Genghis Khan proceeded against Japanese mainland, a freak typhoon came through and threw his ships asunder, and he retreated. And this went down in Japanese lore as the divine wind, which in Japanese is the kamikaze. So Japan had history on its side, it had physics on its side, and the shock to the Japanese psyche, to its military strategy, to its plans, to the public reputation of the military, to the Japanese people, was shattered by the sight of these big, fat, green U.S. Army bombers flying over military targets in Tokyo, bombing Japan as it had done so many cities throughout the Pacific, particularly in China. The initial reports were that Japan had been attacked, and the Roosevelt administration, for a combination of fairly canny political reasons and really quite important strategic reasons, denied any involvement. There was a FDR, President Roosevelt, used to make what were called his fireside chats, where he'd talk about the state of the world, state of the war. And in his fireside chat, only a few days after the bombing of Japan, after the Doolittle Raid, he spoke into the microphone quizzically, simply saying, "And it's said that someone seems to have bombed Japan. How humiliating." And he did it with the voice that, certainly in the United States, we would say that a grandfather uses on Christmas Day to laugh and chortle at the who brought all of these presents? It must be Santa Claus. Indeed, the Roosevelt administration said that the U.S. Army bombers, the Doolittle Raid, had been launched from Shangri-La, secret army bases in Shangri-La, the fictitious Himalayan paradise. And the miraculous aspect of this story was not simply that Japan had been attacked for the first time, but that all but I think altogether 11 of Doolittle's raiders survived and made it home. One crew of one plane had to quickly divert up to Russia. They had misset their carburetors and therefore ran out of gas before they could make their way to safety in China. And the rest of the 15 planes crash landed or ditched in various parts of China in April of 1942, and the crews largely made their way to safety. The image up on the screen is a cave in the specific city of Kuju. That's my pronunciation of it. I know that's a terrible pronunciation of it, so I ask your indulgence. But the city of Kuju, which was the rallying point for the Doolittle Raiders, and Doolittle and a little more than 60 of his men rallied in this cave and took refuge with the assistance of the Chinese in order to make their way ultimately to safety and to return home and to continue to fight the war. This cave, I got the lucky opportunity to visit when I was researching my book. And the walls are still etched with the names of some of the Doolittle Raiders who had taken refuge there. Today, I'm told that it is primarily a place where teenagers go to hide from their parents. But at the time, it was this incredibly important place in the city of Kuju that ultimately led Doolittle and most of his men to safety with the help of the Chinese resistance. We certainly in the United States often hear of the French resistance and their heroism in saving American aviators and fighting against the Germans in Europe. I think too rarely do we hear about the equal efforts at great personal cost of the Chinese resistance, who not only helped the Doolittle Raiders, but American aviators and the war effort against Japan throughout the Pacific, throughout the entirety of World War II. The story of the Doolittle Raiders in Kuju, though, also becomes tragic. This is a map that I was able to find when I was there visiting and doing research, because the Japanese response, as you might expect or fear, was to retaliate, and to retaliate in the most stunning and brutal ways possible. They made a campaign of attacking every airfield in eastern China, to eradicate every airfield, to prevent anything like the Doolittle Raid from ever happening again. This punitive operation, which is the only thing it can be called, led to the vast destruction and burning of villages, the massacre of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Chinese who had been associated with potentially helping the Americans. This map shows the city of Kuju in particular, and even though it's not the greatest loss of life, it was something that profoundly disturbed me when I read it because of its brutal cruelty. Here is a map of the airfield in Kuju that was believed to have essentially proven or enticed the Doolittle Raiders to be their target for safety in China. And the Chinese army, after concussively bombing this city, Japanese records indicate 2,000 sorties over this fairly small city in China. The people on the ground who lived through it described it as thunder that never stopped. But after just utterly devastating this small city in ways that are sadly increasingly familiar when you look at the war in Ukraine, but were just stunning in terms of their human cost and their brutality, the Japanese went in and demanded that the men of the city manually, with their bare hands, with picks and shovels, dig trenches into the airfield in Kuju in order to make it unusable for any airplanes. And it's, again, not the most devastating loss of life from the war. It's not the most spectacular demonstration of bloodiness. But the idea in late spring of making men essentially use their bare hands to dig these trenches that you can see in the map into what is essentially concrete, pressed clay, cement, concrete, is a kind of human brutality and vindictiveness and sadism that it's hard to imagine. And it's the price the people of Kuju paid for what ultimately was a tremendous and celebrated success inside the United States, a rallying cry throughout the war. I mentioned before that the Roosevelt administration was very canny about taking credit for the Doolittle Raid, at least early on. Part of the reason was political. I think Roosevelt understood that the longer he left it as a mystery how this raid on this raid on Japan had happened, the more reporters would spend their time digging into the details of the Doolittle Raid than they would things like the Bataan Death March. But he had another very important reason. It's that two crews of the airplanes, and this really is the point of departure for my book from previous works, but two of the crews were captured by the Japanese army in China. They were subject to unspeakable forms of brutality and torture. They were paraded on newsreels such as this for the curiosity of the Japanese. The torture of the Doolittle Raiders who were captured is ranged everything from sleep deprivation to being hung by the hands for hours, if not days, to protracted solitary confinement, to the waterboard. One man in particular who I write about, one of the Doolittle Raiders, Chase Nielsen, described being forced to kneel on the ground during an interrogation as he was beaten and brutalized by the Japanese, who at one point took a broomstick, or what felt like a broomstick, and put it behind his knees and then pushed him back onto the ground, pushing him further and further so that the torque would pull his kneecaps and the ligaments in his knees. He described the pain as simply numbing, deafening pain, if you will, only to then have his Japanese torturers begin to stomp on his thighs. And he thought in that moment of desperation and pain, that they might just tear him apart. And this was a experience by all of the Americans who were captured by the Japanese. And this photo itself became famous inside of Japan, the photo of the American being taken off the airplane. That's in a Doolittle Raider by the name of Bobby Height, who had grown up in a small town in called Earth, Texas, before essentially bribing his way onto Doolittle's Raid because his plane had not been selected. He bought his way on to being the co-pilot, the 16th plane off the deck, the last plane off the deck. And this was the value he got for his payment. Was being captured by the Japanese, brutalized. He nearly dies in prison. The Japanese confront a real problem, though, with the Doolittle Raiders. Part of that problem is the fact that they've tortured these men. Another part of the problem is that there is a vociferous desire for revenge. And there is a real conflict inside the Japanese government. On the one hand, you have Japanese politicians who, to their credit, stood up for international law and said, look, we cannot, now that we've captured these men, we cannot disregard the Geneva Conventions. We've promised to comply with the Geneva Convention. There are tens of thousands, nearly more than 100,000 really, Japanese citizens and people of Japanese ancestry at that very moment in internment camps inside the United States and elsewhere. And so we need to respect the rights of these prisoners as much as we can, to treat them as prisoners of war. On the other side, you had the hardliners, people like Hajime Sugiyama, who was the war minister, who was the chief of staff of the army, who said, look, we need to behead these men as quickly and as brutally as possible to show the whole world that we will not tolerate attacks against the Japanese. And where I became fascinated by this story, and really ultimately what my book is about, is Hideki Tojo, who was the prime minister and war minister of Japan at the time, had to solve this problem. How do you solve competing demands from your radical hardliners and those who want to comply with international law? He asked the lawyers. He went to the war ministry. He went to the lawyers in the war ministry and said, hey, we need to find a way of killing these guys. Can we do that legally, at least under international law? And the lawyers in the war ministry, at least to their initial credit, said, no, you can't. It's obvious. You can't kill prisoners. And in some documents that I was very lucky to find in a box labeled miscellaneous inside the National Archives, I found a document explaining what happened next, which is that the Japanese government, the war ministry, went back to the lawyers and said, no, I don't think you understand. We have to kill these guys. Is there a way to do it? And certainly in what is a great shame to the legal profession, the Japanese lawyers came up with a plan. They said, we can pass an ex post facto law, we can prosecute the Doolittle Raiders as war criminals, and then we can execute them. That in turn led to the question of, well, what evidence do we have that they committed war crimes? And the Kempeitai, the secret police of Japan, came forward quite readily and said, here we have them. They're confessions that they had taken under torture, but nevertheless confessions to committing atrocities. And so in August of 1942, the Japanese army in Shanghai put the 8 captured Doolittle Raiders on trial under an ex post facto law using evidence obtained by torture. Depending on who you asked, the trial lasted from anywhere from an hour to 2 hours long. And the result was what everyone expected and planned from the very beginning, which was that they would all be executed, all sentenced to death. By the intervention of the doves, as if you could say that, in the cabinet, as well as the Emperor Hirohito, all but 3 had their sentences commuted to life under special conditions, which meant solitary confinement, malnutrition. 3, though, were taken out on it's hard to tell from this picture, but what was in 1942 a golf course nearby Qiangwan, north of Shanghai in China. The 3 were tied to these small little crosses on the ground, shot through the head. Their bodies were incinerated and marked under false names in order to hide their remains. The other 5 were sentenced to solitary confinement and spent the rest of the war inside of Japanese prisons. 1 ultimately dies of a malnutrition disease called wet beriberi. He essentially starves to death in Japanese prison and dies. No real word about what happened to these men is ever released. The Japanese are treating this as essentially a top secret national security secret. A year later, a year after the Doolittle Raid, it's announced that most of the captured raiders, if not all, were executed by the Japanese. This in turn sets off in the American public imagination both a profound desire for revenge and a settling of the Doolittle Raider story. The profound desire for revenge is quite, I would say, miraculously met by the Roosevelt administration, despite calls from members of Congress that all Japanese prisoners should from here on out be executed because of what happened to the Doolittle Raiders. The Roosevelt administration takes a surprisingly, and at that point, really unprecedented legal tack. He says, no, we have lived up to our obligations under things like the Geneva Conventions, and to avenge the Doolittle Raiders, we will not lower ourselves to the barbarism that we confronted. Instead, we will find those who are personally responsible, and we will hold them accountable, calling them essentially a criminal gang. And for the first time, really, in American history, in world history, saying that brutality on the battlefield would be met not by a reprisal of brutality, but by law, by international law, by punishment. The second aspect of this, as I mentioned, is that there is a set narrative about what happened to the captured Doolittle Raiders, the lost Doolittle Raiders. In fact, this is a movie trailer from a movie that was released in 1944 called The Purple Heart. In it, the fate of the captured Doolittle Raiders is imagined, and their show trial is performed as essentially a courtroom drama, where they are brutally tortured. They are ultimately sentenced to death, and it confirms for the American public, if not the world, that the Doolittle Raiders, the captured Doolittle Raiders, are essentially martyrs for the American cause in the war, for the patriotism, for the cause of the rule of law and human rights and all the things that Roosevelt had expressed and insisted on being included in the Atlantic Charter, and that became the foundation for the rules-based legal order that we have lived with ever since. Most of my book, because I do see that my time is running short, and I want to make sure I give my fellow panelists, an opportunity to talk, as well as to take all your questions. But what is ultimately sort of miraculous and stunning to the American people is that at the end of the war, in a prisoner of war camp outside of Beijing called Feng Tai, the Office of Strategic Services liberates a camp and discovers that 4 of the Doolittle Raiders are still alive. One is so badly malnourished, George Barr, he's the man sitting in the bed on the right, that he is initially believed to actually be a corpse, but they ultimately give him medical treatment and resuscitate him, and he ultimately does return to the United States, healthy, if not fully together. And this sets off a new imperative, a new desire to avenge, as Roosevelt had promised, the victimization of the Doolittle Raiders. And what's fascinating, and what I ultimately spend much of the book writing about, is the work of 2 judge advocates. On the far right is a guy named Robert Dwyer, and in the middle a guy named John Hendren, who with Chase Nielsen, who is on the far left, who was one of the captured Doolittle Raiders to survive and return, to basically do a manhunt all over Asia to figure out who is responsible for the torture and execution of the Doolittle Raiders, who should be held responsible. And the amazing thing that they decide, the real precedent-setting thing they decide, and almost incalculably important decision they make, is that the people who are the most responsible for the torture and mistreatment and murder of the Doolittle Raiders are not even the torturers from the Kempe Tai. It's not even the emperor or General Shunroku Hata, who is the head of the Chinese Expeditionary Army in China. It is the lawyers. And they ultimately determined that the people who were the most responsible for the injustice and the torture and the murder of the Doodle Raiders were the judges and lawyers who put on the trial, the general who oversaw it, and the brig commander who carried out the executions under the orders of an unlawful trial. This could be a fairly interesting story of a turnabout of revenge, if it weren't for the fact of this man, not Hideki Tojo, but the man to his right, to his left, on the right of the photograph, who is Edmund Bodine. Edmund Bodine is, to be clear, not a lawyer. He had done a little bit of night school while working as a police officer in New York. But he was a decorated pilot inside China, an American pilot inside China, who had, for reasons I describe in the book, a strong personal incentive to want to stay in Shanghai longer, and ultimately accept what had been a completely thankless and undesirable and dearly avoided task of being the person to represent the Japanese responsible for murdering and torturing the Doolittle Raiders. And it is Bodine, the defense lawyer, the pilot turned defense lawyer, who through pluck, through an abnormal amount of human courage, and I think a basic moral compass that led him to understand it was his job to defend his enemies, the people who had literally attempted to shoot him out of the sky, as he would want to be defended as an American, that I have often described the trial of the Doolittle Trial, the trial of the Japanese responsible for, who were ultimately held responsible for torturing and murdering the Doolittle Raiders, as the first fair war crimes trial. Because in a courtroom in Shanghai, China in 1946, the lawyers for the prosecution and the defense are forced to debate, and earnestly debate, what is a fair trial? What do we owe our enemies in the face of their brutality, in the face of their cruelty and their criminality? And Bodine, at great personal risk and if not personal cost, decides his role is to defend them as he would want to be defended, to apply the golden rule. And so in March and April of 1946, this trial unfolds. It is a trial that is far, far longer and more detailed than the 2-hour trial that the Doolittle Raiders had been given in August of 1942. It is a courtroom drama that far rivals anything Hollywood certainly had imagined to that point. And at the end of it, I think anyone looking at the trial, as unexpected, as jarring, as difficult, and complicated as it ultimately became, would come to the conclusion that justice was done. And the legacy of the trial, though the trial itself has long been forgotten, is enshrined in documents like the Geneva Conventions of 1942, which to this day forbid the denial of a regularly constituted court, which provides all the judicial guarantees recognized as indispensable by civilized people. It creates and establishes, as a matter of treaty law, customary law as well, that the denial of justice is itself a war crime. And so that's the story. It's a remarkable story that touches on so many, I think, forgotten aspects of World War II. One, what we were fighting for and how we really did fight for it, even when it was hard as Americans. Two, the role of the Japanese resistance, not only in saving the Doolittle Raiders, but so many other airmen inside China. In fact, one of the judges on the Doolittle Raid, on the trial in 1946, had been shot down himself. He was a very decorated pilot who would go on to serve in the highest positions inside the United States Air Force. He too was shot down over China and spent essentially a month in hiding by members of the Chinese resistance until he was rescued and in a position to, at least for a time, preside over the Doolittle trial. So it's a history that is incredibly important. It tells us where we have been and why we are where we are and who we are. And so, just by way of closing, I guess I would say that, this, having done the project, I feel like I can answer the question that Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, asked me all those years ago: is why is there a need for another book about the Doolittle Raid? And I think it's because these stories are important. They remind us of who we are, of what we're capable of as people, and how we are, despite all appearances to the contrary, able to make the world better than the one we found it. And so that's my book. That's what I hoped people would take away from it. And I'll stop there because I know I've gone already a bit too long, and just defer to my very, very esteemed fellow panelists, who I'm incredibly humbled to be sharing this Zoom screen with.
Okay. Thank you so much, Michel. This is wonderful. Now I can't wait to get your book. So we'll talk about that a little later, how we can get your book if you have a different link. So now let's get to the panel discussion. Let me spotlight our general before I introduce them. Okay. All right. So it's such an honor to have two generals today to be on the panel discussion. Major General William Chen served on active duty for 32 years, predominantly in assignment in missile and missile defense system acquisition. He served as the commanding general, U.S. Army Missile Command during Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. He was the Army first program executive officer for mission defense, supervising the Army's theater and national missile defense programs. He is a University of Michigan Distinguished Alumnus of Aerospace Engineering. Upon his retirement from the military service, he served in the defense industry for 18 years, including position as VP and Program Director, VP for Engineering Product Development, and VP and General Management for United Defense and Base System. He retired in 2011 and resides in Belmont, Massachusetts. Now, our next general is Major General Darryll Wong. He started his career as a USAF pilot flying C-141 aircraft during the Vietnam War. His flying career has taken him all over the world. He later transferred to the Hawaii Air National Guard and also flew KC-135s with the Hawaii Air National Guard during Kosovo's war and Kosovo War, sorry. He has worked in the Pentagon and various levels of command prior to becoming the commander of Hawaii Air National Guard and then the Adjutant General for the state of Hawaii, commanding Army and Air for the Hawaii National Guard. Unique to his flying career was his time during 7 years of engagement with China on environmental protection with OSD. He also has extensive experience in the Indo-Pacific region, engaging with Indonesia, Philippines, and Taiwan. He retired in 2015 after over 40 years of service. So now I think let's have Major General Darryll Wong to share his pilot perspective of the significance of this mission first. General, you are muted.
Okay, but I think I'm on your video. I saw all of Michel's briefings and slides and things, but I really want to thank Michel. I mean, like you said, Richard Cole, I think, was wrong. There's a lot of stories to be told about the Doolittle Raid. Not to belay the thing, but I think, Michel, I think you've done an excellent job telling parts of the story that no one else has heard. So, let me just give my perspective from a U.S. Air Force aviator. I mean, the Doolittle Raid is a storied example of the grit and the ingenuity and the heroism of the U.S. Air Force pilots in the annals of the U.S. Air Force. If you just look at the song of the U.S. Air Force, it ends with live in fame and die in fame, in flame. So, I mean, it really shows the heroism of these pilots, because when they pilots don't take off from any place without knowing where they're going to land. They're not suicidal at all. But these pilots knew when they left the Hornet that they may not have enough gas to make it to China, because the Hornet was exposed by some Japanese fishermen. So they decided to take off a lot further away from the Japanese coast than they were supposed to. So, but the decision was made to continue to go because this mission was so critical. And in any mission, again, you have to have goals and what you're going to do. I mean, it did hit very strategic targets in Japan, in communications, electronics, even a Navy base, diesel, gas companies and things. But as Michel brought to light, the more important thing also was it brought the war home to the Japanese people. You know, I live in Hawaii, and most of the people that lived through Pearl Harbor understand the confusion and everything that happened then. But the Japanese people, this war was way off their shore. The Doolittle Raiders brought this war back to the shores of Japan. But I think the other thing that hasn't been told, and it's part of what Michel has highlighted, is that now Japan felt they are, their shores are not protected by distance. So they were forced to hold 4 squadrons of fighters back just to protect themselves because of the Doolittle Raid. But it also took away 50 plus battalions of Japanese soldiers as they went up the east coast of China, doing these horrific acts that Michel had described in what he talked about. So, you know, the result of all this thing is probably my thinking as I listen to Michel and as I know of the Doolittle Raid. The raid is a storied raid. I mean, it is history, and it is something that should be told forever and ever. And any U.S. Air Force pilot always knows about this Doolittle Raid. But to me, the untold story is the Chinese heroes who helped these airmen. These airmen, like I said, their plan was to land in Chongqing and refuel and go home. But again, because of the distance from the carrier, they knew they would not possibly make it to China. So as they made their runs and headed towards China, you know, they were running out of gas. Some of them bailed, some of them landed in the ocean. But it is the heroes, these Chinese, who rescued these pilots as they crash landed, parachuted offshore into fields and rice paddies and the hills of eastern China. The selflessness of the Huzhou villagers who helped rescue them, fed them, hid them, and even some of the Chinese freedom fighters who helped them get back to Chongqing. I mean, there's more details, but I just want to highlight these airmen could not have done what they did, knowing they didn't have a safe haven in flying to China. And the other thing, you know, 51 airmen in all survived a lot of this. But again, it was not through their own efforts. It was the efforts of the Chinese villagers in these villages that helped save them. You know, again, Japan retaliated with massacres in these villages. And in all, I think, I don't have the details, but I think from what I understand, 250,000 Chinese died because of this raid and the retaliation by the Japanese. So in summarizing, so the keys, I think, in understanding the importance of the Chinese in turning the tide of war during World War II, there are so many threads of what would have turned the tide, including Midway and everything else. But the heroic efforts of the Chinese civilians who helped these 51 crewmen who made it into China, the torture and the execution that they faced in doing this, and the 250,000 plus Chinese that were brutally killed and retaliated on because of this raid, helped to turn the tide of war. So I think this one thread that I would like to leave with everyone is the Chinese really helped in the World War II effort. The Doolittle Raid is a tremendous accomplishment of the U.S. Airmen. But again, the untold story of the Chinese heroes who were retaliated against that helped turn the tide of war, that turned the focus of Japan in keeping 4 squadrons of fighters back home and in keeping thousands of troops looking for villagers and things during post this raid. In ending, you know, the city of Tucson, Arizona gave the 80 Doolittle Raiders 80 silver goblets, and each of them would raise these goblets during their reunions. Now that all the Doolittle Raiders have passed, all these goblets are turned over at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. But I think I read somewhere that someone also said that one more goblet needs to be added to the collection. This one in the name of thousands of Chinese who paid the ultimate price for the Doolittle Raid. So again, I want to thank Michel for highlighting all the details you have. And I think Richard Cole was right. There is not enough written on the Doolittle Raid. So Esther, thank you for allowing me an opportunity to participate.
Thank you so much, Major General Darryll. So now I will have Major General William Chen for his view.
Thank you, Esther. My remarks might be a little controversial because I'd like to talk about a major shortcoming or flaw in the planning of the Doolittle Raid, and that is the failure to inform and involve Claire Chennault in the raid, knowing that the bomber crews had to fly to China after bombing Tokyo. And here we get into issues of leadership, relationships, perhaps politics, secrecy, and trust. At the time of the Doolittle Raid in April of 1942, there were no U.S. Army Air Force units in China. There was the American Volunteer Group, headed by General Chennault. At that time, he was a civilian, and they were better known as the Flying Tigers. But Chennault was a contractor. The pilots and the ground crew were all contractors. However, as Americans, they were the first Americans to strike against the Japanese, and that was in December of 1942. Now, there were plans in July of 1942 for the American Volunteer Group to disband and be integrated into the Army Air Forces. What's significant is that on April 14th, 4 days before the Doolittle Raid, Chennault was recalled to active duty as a colonel. And then 2 weeks later, he was promoted to brigadier general. So when Doolittle arrived in China, and then as he departed, then Chennault was there in the transition of between a colonel and a brigadier general. However, although Chennault was in China, Brigadier General Clayton Bissell in India was the air boss in China, and he outranked Chennault. Now, General Bissell knew about the Doolittle Raid, but neglected to tell Chennault that the raid was to take place. When Chennault found out about it, he was absolutely furious and extremely upset because Chennault had established an early warning air defense net in China. He had built airfields in China. Had he known about the Doolittle Raid, he could have helped to direct Doolittle's bombers to friendly airfields, and aircraft and crewmen could have been saved. So why is it that Chennault wasn't informed about the Doolittle Raid? And here we might have to conjecture. First is the concern for security. There was concern that if Chennault was told about the Doolittle Raid, he would tell Chiang Kai-shek. And then, of course, the concern that word would really get out. However, there was also the rumor that Chiang Kai-shek was told about the raid, but he didn't tell Chennault. But I think it really goes back to the top leadership. Chennault didn't get along with the top leadership in Washington. That's General Marshall and General Arnold, who was head of the Army Air Forces. And in the China-Burma-India theater, Chennault didn't get along with the theater commander, General Stilwell, nor General Bissell, who worked for Stilwell. With Chennault's involvement, Doolittle's aircraft could have been safely directed to landing fields, and perhaps that could have averted some of the Japanese retaliation. The lessons learned are that access to information is critical, and there's the need to give access to those who can help. And of course, in my personal opinion, Chennault could have helped. Otherwise, we suffer the consequences. And of course, the consequences were the ditching of the aircraft. The crews were largely saved, but then the massive retaliation against the Chinese. Now, we cannot rewrite history. We don't know what the outcome would have been had Chennault been involved, but at least we know from Chennault's reputation that he would have done something. And so with that, Esther, turn it back over to you.
Okay, so General Bill, do you know any Chinese American who were associated with the Doolittle Raid or their rescue or evacuation?
Well, I think we can clearly say that for the Doolittle Raid itself, the pilots, Doolittle, et cetera, that there were no Chinese Americans supporting him. On the USS Hornet, for example, I don't think anybody really knows, but I would suspect that in our process, when we registered for the Congressional Gold Medal, veterans had an opportunity to say a few words, tell a little bit about their story, and had there been any Chinese American sailors on board that aircraft carrier, we could have found out about it. Now, there was a Chinese American pilot who flew for CNAC, China National Aviation Corporation, who also flew the hump. And then those pilots and ground crew of CNAC became veterans. And in this case, Moon F. Chen was involved in evacuation of Jimmy Doolittle from China to India. And his direct story is that he was piloting an aircraft and he was in Chongqing. At the airfield was the US ambassador and Jimmy Doolittle. And then they boarded the aircraft, flew to Kunming, where Doolittle deplaned and met with General Chennault. And then after that session with General Chennault, and the aircraft took off, and had to go to a stop in Burma, and they later to India. And so the reality, however, was that when Moon Chen flew out Doolittle, that he didn't know about the Doolittle Raid, because that was still kept in secrecy. It wasn't until they landed in New Delhi that Moon Chen found out about the Doolittle Raid, and he was carrying this very precious customer. In fact, Moon Chen went to China. He's a Chinese American from Baltimore. He went to China in 1933 and had occasion to meet Jimmy Doolittle in 1933 when Doolittle was there for an air show. So to my knowledge, the only Chinese American veteran that was related and associated with Doolittle was Captain Moon Chen from CNAC.
Okay, so Major General Darryll, can I address the same question to you? Have you met any of the Doolittle Raid or anybody?
Similar to what Bill talked about, you know, hopefully in the Congressional Gold Medal Awards, that people would come out and talk about those people. You know, the Chinese don't talk a lot about themselves, so it's important to try to get their families to at least let us know. But I don't know of any Chinese that were part of or associated with the Hornet or with the Doolittle maintenance crews on the deck and things.
I muted myself. Yeah, thank you, Major General Darryll. Okay, so let's go to Q&A. So that's a question, say, are there any war memorial in mainland China that honors the Doolittle Raiders or museums? I think that will goes to Michel.
Not really, no. There is some commemoration of the raid in Kyushu, obviously because of its significant relevance and what the Japanese had done there. And so there is a museum. The city museum of Kyushu has like an exhibit, and there may be like a plaque about it, but there is no, not that I've been aware of, not that I've been told about. There is no sort of standing memorial to the Doolittle Raid and to the Doolittle Raiders, and there should be. I think, you know, I mean, one of the stories I didn't mention in my presentation, but I think is, you know, extremely indicative, is Chase Nielsen, who was one of the Doolittle Raiders who I pointed to, who ended up being very important in the ultimate trial. It was the key witness, really, the star witness in the trial in 1946. His plane crash landed in off the ocean, off a I'm not going to pronounce this any better than I did anything else, but a fishing village at the time, which is now a somewhat major town, called Jushi, in about 100 miles south of Shanghai. And the mayor, Shimiao Yang, or alderman of the town, took the three survivors of that crash into his home. Two of the men in the Doolittle Raid, two of the fatalities of the raid, actually died in that crash. And the people of Jushi helped bury them in graves overlooking the ocean. Ultimately, their bodies were exhumed at the end of the war and taken back to the United States, but they gave them a proper, honorable burial, and they had taken safe harbor and given safe harbor to the three survivors in this town until some Japanese allied guerrillas came in, discovered the Doolittle Raiders, turned them over to the Japanese. Precisely what happened is unclear, just because war crimes aren't documented as well then as they are now. But by all accounts that seem apparent, this mayor, Shimiao Yang, was summarily executed by the Japanese, or by the Chinese allied, Japanese allied guerrillas, in this punitive operation that followed. That he was just summarily executed, probably, you know, with, you know, where he stood for his help of the Doolittle Raiders. And so there are a lot of heroes in the Chinese resistance. I call them the Chinese resistance, and I think that's you know, that's appropriate, because they, at great cost to themselves, contributed to the American war effort in China and the Pacific, you know, as much, if not more, than many of their French counterparts. And I have a French name, so I say that with full humility and recognition of what it takes to be a resistance fighter.
Okay, so that's one more question. That's another question. Oops, it was typing and moved out. On one of the slides, it shows what looked like Chinese laborers aboard the deck of Hornets. Were these Chinese American?
No, those were Japanese. So as I think it was, I can't remember. I think it was General Chen mentioned the Hornet, which was the aircraft carrier that was taking the Doolittle Raiders to the coast of China, got spotted by a Japanese picket boat, that the USS Enterprise, which was the companion aircraft carrier as part of the military task force, the naval task force, ultimately sent, I think, a battleship after, and sank that ship, and then captured the Japanese sailors on board. And that was an image of the Japanese sailors who we essentially rescued from the sea after sinking their ship, the Nitomaru.
Okay. Did the ROC armed forces, especially Chiang Kai-shek, reacted to the raid? How?
Well, I'll try and answer that.
Yeah.
I think, given the concentration of Japanese forces, they're fighting, attacking the villagers and whatnot. There was really, and that was centered mostly on the east coast of China. So the Chiang Kai-shek's forces were not there.
Okay.
That's right. Chiang Kai-shek was very instrumental once they got to Kuju and essentially getting them out of the country. In fact, one of the clips, I ended up having to cut it short just for time. One of the clips actually shows Madame Chiang Kai-shek pinning a medal on Doolittle's chest before he departs. So they're very instrumental in getting Doolittle and his raiders out of the country after they had gotten into unoccupied or friendly territory.
Okay, thank you. I understand that there were many missionaries in the town the Japanese raided that harbored the Doolittle Raiders. Did the Japanese take vengeance on these missionaries? Would you know?
I'm trying to think if I can't recall any immediate instances of it, although John Birch was an American missionary, if that's who you're referring to. I'm trying to remember, but John Birch was actually an American missionary in China at the time, and was one of the people who was instrumental in helping Doolittle get to safety. John Birch is famously the first American killed, I think, by the People's Liberation Army after the war. But during the raid, that's the only missionary I can think of. Although there were other documents. Sorry to have to recall all of this from my child-addled brain. But one of the accounts that I where I got that reference that I mentioned during my presentation, that Kuju felt like it was in essentially a perpetual state of thunder, actually came from a missionary whose name I've forgotten, who was in Kuju at the time. And
the Smithsonian had a very good article about the Japanese attacking the villagers and the retaliation. And then they also interviewed American missionaries. And so apparently these missionaries at least did survive.
Okay, so right now past 5 minutes, 9 o'clock. So Major Darryll, would you like to close up and do a conclusion on our book talk?
Esther, thank you very much. Again, Michelle, thanks a lot for detailing a lot of other things and then filling in a lot of questions that a lot of myself as a U.S. Air Force airman did not understand enough about the Doolittle Raiders. But I think I want to end in just this thought that, no war is won by the Army, Air Force, or Navy, but a lot of civilians help in this effort. And I think the Doolittle Raid highlighted what the Chinese have done and the ensuing and the help that they provided the Doolittle Raiders to get back to the United States. And also the retaliation by the Japanese on the Chinese. The amount of Chinese that died for to save 80 airmen is quite an untold story. I think China really helped the effort in winning World War II by turning the focus of Japan inward for a little while at least. So that's kind of like what I hope I can leave everyone thinking about. But again, thanks, Bill, for your insights. And again, Michelle, I look forward to reading your book entirely.
Okay, so again, thank you, Michelle. So where can we get your book? Was that a link or something that you can type it in the chat box so people can get it? Or you can send it to me. I can share it with all the attendees or even on my Facebook page.
Yeah, it's available on Amazon wherever books are sold. I just dropped the a short Amazon link into the chat so people can use that. Or you can take it out of the library. It's free, so you don't need. So.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much for your time. It was a great book talk, and I want to thank you both, General, Thank you for your view, your insight. I mean, I personally learned so much, and I am sure all the attendants do as well. And thank you for all the attendants for spending this 1 hour with us. I hope you guys learned a lot from them too. So happy Easter.
Okay, and, thank you for hosting this.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting. It's such an important anniversary, and so
thank you, and happy Patriots Day, as Wilson reminded me. Yes, yes. So we're all Americans. So thank you very much, and everybody have a good night, and hope to see you in May for our AAPI Talks 2022.